Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, the author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. This will be another one of those podcasts where we deviate from our normal script, wherein we take a business article, a political article perhaps, and analyze it through the lens of culture and values. What we want to do today is return to one of the core concepts of the book and discuss it in a little bit more detail. And that is the distinction between culture as desired, as communicated, as understood, and as lived. So, when we're looking at the articles in the news, most often what we're discussing is the culture as actually lived, whether that's the culture of the media, the culture of the company, the culture of the geographic structure that we happen to be evaluating. And so I want to start out first and foremost with the notion of the desired culture. When you start up a business and you have a clear, compelling vision for what you want that business to be, it's rather natural, as the founder of that business, to be able to kind of clearly articulate these are the kind of behaviors that we need in order to make that happen. In fact, in my own consulting practice, that's one of the things that I do, is to help companies first clearly articulate their purpose. It can be harder than you might think sometimes. And then translate that purpose into the behaviors that we need to see throughout the company in order to best fulfill it. So let me give you a for instance. When you think about a company, say, like 7-Eleven. 7-Eleven operates a chain of convenience stores, often with gas stations. What is it that company exists to do? What is its purpose? And I think when you give it any amount of thought, you'll realize that the purpose of a 7-Eleven is really to enable its customers to get the essential things they need quickly, 24 hours a day, because that's when they're open. And so, with that in mind, you then start to think about, well, how would a company that does that the best, that attains that full vision, that is truly indispensable in fulfilling that function, how do they operate? How will we describe them? Well, you say first and foremost, you got to be pretty close to the customer because you need to understand their needs. If you're going to have a chance of fulfilling that obligation, you got to understand their needs. Secondly, you got to be pretty efficient because one of the major ways that you could do that would be to have a huge store stocked with everything. Well, that doesn't really work, right? The economics of it aren't right because these stores are generally fairly small. You need to be fairly innovative because those needs change. And so you got to kind of change with it. And 7-Eleven in the 70s was very different than 7-Eleven today. 7-Eleven used to be famed for its Big Gulp drink. But in an era where people are more health concerned and worried about obesity, the Big Gulp is maybe not the thing you want to hang your hat on, right? I'll tell you one thing that a 7-Eleven is known for that people may not realize, but most of the trucking and delivery in the country is actually done overnight. That's when all the boxes magically move, kind of like the pods in Invasion of the Body Snatcher. from town to town. It's when your over-road trucking really goes. So the orders go out after dark, and then they travel all night so that they can be where they need to be first thing in the morning. And 7-Eleven is a destination for a lot of truckers. Why would you think truckers would go to 7-Eleven? Well, first off, they can get gas, and then truckers need gas. Secondly, it's one of the few places where you can get a decent meal at any time of night. Now, in addition, they also have some essentials that, hey, if your beat is middle of the night on the road, you're going to be in some rural areas, so you need some place that's located near you. They got to have enough stores, and those stores have to be open, and those stores have to have the stuff that you're looking for. So 7-Elevens are pretty darn popular with truckers for this very reason. I bet when they started, that was not something that they considered, but that over time, they've come to realize it, and they've been pretty innovative in being able to service that market. So as you start picking it apart and getting down into some things that they might value, then you start drilling further into that and saying, well, what do you need to do? What do you need to be able to do in order to achieve that value? So if you're going to talk about customer focus, okay, in order to deliver that kind of customer focus, that kind of customer service, that kind of customer experience, well, darn it, we got to know our customer. So you may find that when you go to hire people, you need to have people that have some personal skills in order to do that. How do you get to know someone if you don't like people? That in order for the company to be as efficient as it needs to be, you need to make decisions based on facts and data and not emotion. And that may change who you hire, who you fire. And then, of course, as you continue down the path, you can get finer and finer gradations of behavior that you need to see on a consistent basis in order to make that happen. Perhaps, for example, part of the customer experience might be anytime, day or night, we got a smile on our face. Now you're getting down to something tangible that's built in, an actual behavior that you can measure, you can see, you can train, and it helps build up your culture. You know, you think about In-N-Out Burger, the West Coast fast food chain. And you go to In-N-Out Burger, and one of the things you notice is, number one, they are always busy. They are crazy busy, no matter which location you're looking at, really no matter what time you're looking at. They are busy. But they're always pleasant. They seem like they enjoy what they do. Sometimes you go to McDonald's, you go to Wendy's, you go to Burger King, you have a different experience. So I can only imagine that the founders of In-N-Out insisted on that kind of pleasantness, positive attitude, etc., as part of their culture in their hiring and firing. So when we think about culture as desired, what we're doing is trying to posit what is the perfect culture in order to fulfill our purpose perfectly. You may have flown Southwest Airlines, and you'll notice that one of the things that Southwest Airlines does is that they have their flight attendants sometimes crack jokes over the radio. Little innocuous things. It's just a way of making air travel a little more fun. You know, that was by design. Stodgy old airlines might not like that kind of thing, but Southwest operated differently. Southwest also, you notice, when you board on Southwest, you don't have assigned seats. That's also a departure from the normal practice, but that's part of their culture. That's what makes them different. Their objective is to get people on the plane seated and get away from that gate as fast as possible because it saves money. And their purpose is to be the low cost carrier on the routes that they service. So you can see how the behaviors kind of tie into that. And they're trying to create their ideal company in order to suit that purpose. That's culture as desired. Now, at any given time, in any given area of our company, we fall a bit short of that. And we can fall a bit short of that for different reasons. Number one is perhaps we haven't done a great job of communicating what our desired culture is and what behaviors we're looking for. This is a particular challenge in businesses where you have high turnover, very seasonal businesses. For example, when you take a look at companies like Amazon, they bring on a lot of people all at once, and so they've had to develop very effective mechanisms to kind of transmit the culture to those people, even though they know that a number of them may not be here in a week. So you have to have effective ways to communicate that culture and what you're all about on an ongoing basis because there's always someone new coming in. If you fail to communicate the culture as a leadership team, and remember, culture emanates from leadership, that's the only place it can come from, really, then what you're going to get is your culture communicated through the lens of whomever happens to be talking about whatever at 3 a.m. on the floor. So it may not be a great distillation of your culture. You think of a scenario where we go back to that customer experience kind of value, and perhaps you may have heard it articulated as the customer is always right. Now, I don't know about you, but my experience in dealing with most companies has not been they've treated me like I was always right. In fact, more often than not, when there is a problem and I have to talk to somebody, they generally treat me first as though I were completely wrong. And this, I think, is because of the way the culture gets communicated. If you truly believe that the customer is always right, if you honestly believe that, then when somebody comes to you with something that technically violates a policy for a refund or a return, you'll just shake your head and say, okay, well, we'll get this taken care of for you. And that's the end of it. What you won't do is argue with them that it's against policy, it's not fair, yada, yada, yada. You won't see that if you believe that truly believe that the customer is always right, if you have that value. But what I think has happened in those cases is that as the telephone game got played and communicated what we mean by the customer is always right, what behaviors we want to see, has gotten distorted as the message was passed down the line from top management down to the lower levels, probably with caveats. And so it starts from someone reading this to their team and saying, well, we don't mean that they're always right. We mean that, hey, when they do what the policy says they're supposed to do, then we'll give them a refund. And things like, well, up to a point, we don't want to lose money on this. Those sorts of caveats are injected, and that really compromises the culture as desired in the form of the culture as it was communicated. But even when the culture is perfectly communicated, it still may not be properly understood. And so you have to consider the frontline customer-facing teammate in these situations. Do they really understand that they are empowered to do what the culture says they should do? Or is it something that's really just being given lip service? And they have to worry about that because they're the ones who are going to get in trouble with their frontline supervisor for doing what the culture said to do. And it's not unusual in an organization to have a disconnect between, say, middle management and upper level management. Upper level management thinks the culture is being honored to the fullest extent. Middle management's being measured on different things and maybe soft pedaling certain aspects of the culture accordingly. Even if the culture and the values it embodies are perfectly communicated and understood, you still have a question as to whether that culture is being lived. So we think about, say, a military culture in wartime. There was a great study that's now in book form that Colonel Dave Grossman did a number of years ago, where he was taking a look at killing in war. And what he was trying to determine is who actually does the killing in warfare. Because while everyone has the perception that, especially in wartime, especially when you start looking at frontline infantry personnel, that they are actively seeking the enemy and trying to kill them, this is not really the case. And what Grossman found was that it's actually a small proportion of the troops who ever fire their weapon at anybody, an even smaller proportion who aim at their enemy, and a tiny fraction that hit their enemy and try to kill them. It was a remarkable finding in a lot of ways, but it makes a lot of sense. We have a strong taboo against taking someone else's life, even in a situation which would be morally justified, such as fighting a just war. Certainly in World War II, when the United States was fighting Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and for a time, Fascist Italy, well, it was perfectly licit for any Christian soldier on the US side to try and kill a Nazi, a Japanese soldier, an Italian soldier. It was all morally justified. And yet, something within us rebels at taking another human life, even when we risk our own in the process. And so you think back to an event in World War I, which saw some of the nastiest, hardest fighting, most brutal combat that the world has ever seen in the trenches in Western Europe. And on Christmas Day, I believe it was 1916, so midway point of the war, the Germans and the British and the French got together in no man's land and had a Christmas party with music and food, the whole 9 yards, played soccer in no man's land. Really disturbed the higher ups, who wanted to make sure that nothing like that ever happened because there was a war on. A war that would grind for 2 more bloody years and kill almost an entire generation of European manhood before it in turn set the stage for an even bloodier war to come. So when you look at the military culture, which when you think about it is really kind of all about killing your enemy, and there's no doubt that soldiers in wartime know that their job is to kill the enemy. No question of it. They've been trained to do just that. They've shown aptitude at doing just that. And they've been in combat situations where their NCOs and their officers have ordered them to do just that. So there's no question what the desired culture is, whether it was communicated, whether it was understood. The problem is they still don't live it. When I say problem, I don't mean from a humanitarian perspective. I mean from the standpoint of the purpose of the organization, which, as Rush Limbaugh has famously said of the military, is to kill people and break things. So we have an issue often with the culture, even when communicated and understood, not being lived to the fullest extent. So what do we do in those situations? Well, to some extent, you have to control that through hiring and firing, because ultimately, if someone firmly resolves that they are not going under any circumstance to live out your culture, if you want to live out your culture, you have no choice but to get somebody else. No choice. During the American Revolution, one of the problems that the American side had was that most of the troops were militia. These were just normal citizens who picked up a rifle, had some minimal amount of training, and then were asked to face a professional British army on the field of battle. And it was very difficult to get the militia to actually stand and fight. The Continental Army itself was a much more highly professional army. They had sometimes their own troubles with that, but by and large, they would do the job that was asked of them. The militia viewed it as, hey, I'm patriotic up to a point, but somebody's going to run the farm back home, and I just assume that be me. So it was a market challenge when they wouldn't live out their culture. Much of the unrest of the United States has come about as a result of police officers not living out their culture. Or perhaps more accurately by saying that in some precincts, a subculture has arisen in response to the daily grind of police work, wherein black suspects are treated markedly differently than white suspects, where excess force is used despite the officers being well trained on the avoidance of same. And so you have to look at it as a situation where the culture that is desired for a police officer is not being lived out by a substantial portion of the police force in some areas. What makes this worse is that there is a culture which is lived out within the police ranks, and that is the notion of the thin blue line. It's that often the only thing standing between society and anarchy is that thin blue line of police officers, and they protect their own. Thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow police officer. And so what this leads to is when you have bad cops who violate policy, who do not do what they're supposed to do, who commit crimes in some cases, then you have good cops who cover up for them. And it results in real dysfunction and injustice. So as we consider the cultural landscape in our own companies, it makes sense that we should try to reduce the gap as much as possible between culture as desired, as communicated, as understood, and as lived. Ultimately, we want the culture that we live to be the culture that we envision. And that takes a lot of very hard work. It doesn't happen by accident. It's constant reinforcement. I watched the movie The Founder some months ago, which was about Ray Kroc and McDonald's. And what was interesting about that particular story was that the original founders of McDonald's were really sticklers for the fast food culture. And they had very precise work instructions as to how things were to be done. because the idea was to give good service very quickly. And so they had processes which they expected to be followed to the letter. They worked side by side with the folks in their restaurants to make sure that those standards were maintained. And they were sticklers for detail. So their constant reinforcement of this is the way you do this. This is how you take a patty, form a patty, fry a patty. This is how you present the bun. This is how you put the ketchup on it, whatever. It was all insanely detailed because they wanted to make sure that the customer experience was up to snuff at every location. And they were very reluctant to expand the franchise in accordance with Croc's vision because they didn't want to lose control of those standards. You know, you hear the same thing with regard to Colonel Harlan Sanders, who was the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken, who used to lament in his later days that the gravy that was served at a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant was completely inedible. It had nothing to do with the gravy that he used to serve. So it was a case where the original culture had been supplanted by new leadership, much to the chagrin of the original founder. They'd started to drift from the desired culture. So as we look at our own companies, the takeaway is this. Number one, know your purpose. What does your company uniquely exist to do? Translate that purpose into the culture which most perfectly does that. That is your desired culture. Ruthlessly assess your culture as lived against that standard. Are you living up to that desired culture or not? And if you're not, take swift action to do something about it. Start with making sure that your communication is clear. Make sure that people truly understand what it is you mean by it. Translate those high-level abstract values into tangible behaviors in your key processes. This will help your management teams reinforce those behaviors properly. Constantly check to make sure that your culture is being lived. And when it's not, you need to take swift action to correct it, up to the point of firing people who refuse to live it properly. If you do these things, you will find it suddenly much easier for your company to achieve its purpose. You'll do better, and it'll be a lot less effort to produce those kind of results. Because at the end of the day, management fads come and go, but culture is everything. Thank you and have a great day.